Dan Savage, welcome to Head on Fire. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a real thrill.
The real thrill for me. So, for folks who made the three people who are going to listen to this show that don't already know who you are, could you tell people who you are and what it is that you do?
I am Dan Savage. I'm a writer and podcaster, an author. I have been writing Savage Love, a weekly sex advice column, for 34 years and hosting the Savage Lovecast for 16 or 17 years. I forget how long I've been doing it. I started writing Savage Love 34 years ago as a joke. I was going to write a sex advice column for straight people as a gay man
Uh
and
huh.
give straight people advice the way straight people had always given us advice, like not with our best interests at heart, usually. And it was a joke. And I wrote kind of a joke, Ann Landers, Xavier Hollander style advice column. And then I started getting tons of real questions from straight people who kind of liked being the butt of the joke. And it turned into a real advice column by accident. And it ate my life. So be
Do you
careful
ever
about the jokes you make in print because they have a way.
do you ever look back and when your friend was creating The Stranger, did you ever look back and think, maybe I shouldn't have made that joke? Maybe what would life have been like had I not made that joke?
Yes, sometimes. I'm a Sondheim fan. You're always sorry, you're always grateful. There's no life without regret. I have a degree in theater. The first
Hmm.
thing I did when I moved to Seattle was start a theater. And we did, my theater was called Greek Active, which is a joking reference to some gay code from 50 years ago. People, instead of saying I'm a top or a bottom, would say I'm Greek active or Greek passive. Greek was anal. Greek active was you were the person doing the penetrating. Greek passive was you were the person being penetrated. And I named my theater company Greek Active because I loved seeing it in the headlines when we would open a
I did not
show.
know that.
Yeah. And it
Also,
was,
I know I'm gonna put some kind of warning up here, but sorry, mom. I guess this is
yeah, it's always explicit with me. I can't help it. But I directed tons of shows. Our theater was a huge success. And I look at the shows I did and I always think if I had moved to New York and done those shows, I would have the
Mm,
theater career I wanted to have. But no
mhm.
guarantees it would have been a success. Maybe the
Yeah.
theater career I wanted to have, or a shot at the theater career I wanted to have. And instead, I was sort of in Seattle, couldn't leave Seattle, then met my husband who would never leave Seattle. And, the decades flew by. And I think about the shows I did, and I'm really proud of them. But doing theater in Seattle is like, I don't know, doing mime in the dark. It doesn't really matter in the long run, and not a lot of people are going to see it.
So when did you become Dan Savage? Like when did you become like the big deal that you ended up becoming? And what was that moment like when you realized, oh no, people know who I am now, and my opinion means things to people?
It was a long time ago. I was writing Savage Love. I was editing The Stranger, which was Seattle's big alt weekly at the time. There was a lot of ferment and controversy in gay politics, queer politics, and I was doing a lot of writing about it. And it was actually Urvashi Vad, the activist, former head of the NGLTF, recently passed away, which is so sad. She was such a terrific person and presence in the movement. And she came to town, and I was like kind of locking horns with a gay organization and like writing my column and getting a lot of kind of weird pushback from gay people and queer people about my column and about me. And I was at lunch with Urvashi, and I was like, I don't understand like the fervor and rage of some of the response I get from gay people. And she was like, oh, I totally get it. Straight people read you. That makes you more dangerous if you take one step off the ranch. If you a little step out of line when it's a gay writer being read by straight people is a threat in a way that it's just not when it's a gay person writing for a gay publication or a gay readership. And it was kind of an accident. I had been ACT UP. I was a gay activist
Hmm.
since high school. And, you know, you carry signs around, you do ACT UP, you do the marches, you do the die-ins. You would hope to create the kind of protest or zap that led the news, and the photos got in the paper and you could reach people. And then I started writing Savage Love, which was a joke where I was mostly writing about straight people 90% of the time. And then 10% of the time, I would write about the HIV/AIDS crisis. I would write about uh, the vulnerability that gay people in same-sex relationships experienced because we couldn't marry, because we couldn't determine for ourselves our own immediate next of kin, and the danger that put us all in, which was made really evident during the AIDS crisis,
Mhm.
when people who hadn't seen their families of origin for 30 years or 20 years were suddenly sick and dying, and parents or siblings who'd had no role in their life would show up at the hospital and throw the boyfriend out, and change the locks in the apartment and throw the boyfriend out.
I don't know
And
how I didn't put together until just now that you became a a a gay an inroad into queer culture for straight people at a time when
there weren't many.
there weren't there weren't many, and we were all dying because straight people didn't humanize us and didn't see
Right.
our
And so really the column was my kind of activism. I would write
mm,
about straight people, tell a lot of jokes, and then every once in a while I would get really serious about gay families, gay adoption, the way trans people are treated, platforming trans writers and thinkers and voices 25 years ago, before that even had a name, before anyone could describe that as what I was doing. And tricking straight people who would read my entire column out of force of habit, because it was usually funny and usually about them. And then they would
mm,
just read it when it was about us in a way they wouldn't read something about us that was in a queer publication or from a queer press, or in a queer paper that they weren't going to pick up and read. And it was, it gave the column a kind of power in the 90s that was hard for some queer people to accept, that I'd sort of blundered into this role and this kind of power and reach into young straight people's minds. And yeah, I really have enjoyed it. It's been a wonderful life.
I'm using your language of blundering into the career. I can't when I was thinking about you and your career and your the fact that you did have a theater degree and that's how you got into this work. Everybody has a first Dolly Parton movie. Mine was Straight Talk. It was the one that liked to replay on Saturday afternoons, and I can't help but think how much Dolly's character in that movie mirrors your own actual career, and that she like the big thing for her was she was pretending, or the radio station assumed that she was this doctor and psychology and relationships and stuff, and she just didn't correct him. But
I've never
that
seen
was
this
the big
movie.
reveal, like, oh, you don't have any expertise. But in the realm of professionally having an opinion, that doesn't seem to mean much. And I found that out last fall when I got the opportunity to interview Pulitzer Prize winning art critic Jerry Saltz. And I asked him a question I'm going to ask you now. Why is your opinion so great? Like, why is your advice so valuable? Why is your
people have been
opinion so
saying
much better than everybody else's?
People have been saying this to me forever, really, since I started writing the column. What credentials do you have? Look up advice in the dictionary. It says opinion about what could or should be done. The only credential you need to give advice is somebody who was fool enough to ask your opinion.
Mm,
And so it's just my opinion. It's not binding arbitration. Advice columns really kind of workshopped in advance of the invention of the internet, that kind of bloggy format where there was this back
sure.
and forth with the readers. And Ann Landers would write a column. She'd get a bunch of responses. She'd run some of the responses, respond to the responses, sometimes concede that the readers or a particular reader was right and she was wrong. And there was this permeability and back and forth in an advice column that now characterizes the media all over. But then was unique really to this kind of lowbrow genre writing of the advice column. So, what gives me the right? Where are my credentials? I have none. People ask me questions. I always have gone out and found experts, doctors, researchers to come in, and people with relevant lived experience, sex workers, trans people,
Hmm.
to come into the column and give advice with me and have a conversation with me, and sometimes just give the column over to somebody who knows better than I do. So am I an expert? No, I'm an expert at finding the right expert. That I'm expert at. But I don't have a degree in anything except I know how to fence. I know how to juggle. I learned that at theater school, but that doesn't come in handy in
Know how to
print.
fake a good slap.
Yeah, exactly. I can fall. One of the things I got early, which I thought was so telling, and that I don't get this kind of pushback anymore, was straight people would write in and say, "What do you know about straight relationships?" Projecting onto me or us the kind of ignorance that they had of gay relationships. It's possible to be an adult straight human and know nothing about gay
Mhm.
people or gay relationships. It is not possible to be an adult gay human and know nothing about straight relationships. And people would write and say, "What do you know about being straight?" It was like, well, I tried to be straight, faked it for a very long time. My parents are straight. My siblings are straight. Most of my friends are straight. I've been to a lot of straight weddings. I've had straight sex. I think I know more about being straight than the average straight person knows about being gay. I've made a very close study of straightness and straight people, in part because I was negotiating from a position of terror and fear. And you have to, if you're the, I don't know, if you're the rabbit, you have to really have good kind of situational awareness of the eagles who might be flying overhead. And, to be a gay teenager in Chicago in the 70s was to be the rabbit.
Mhm.
And you paid very strict attention to the people who, including your own parents, who could sweep in and do you real harm.
I've heard that said before when discussing things like white privilege and how it's invisible to most white people. Cisgender heterosexual white folks just don't realize the privileges that they have, but black people do. People of color do.
Mm-hmm.
My husband lives. He's a Mexican immigrant. He lives in a very different world than I do. People talk to him, treat him very, very differently than they treat me. And it is so interesting that you use that example of the rabbit and the eagles overhead, because yeah, we probably know more about the dynamics of your relationships and what it's like to be in them and what it's like to wield the privileges that you have than you ever will, because we're on the
And
receiving end
with
of it.
and with very few exceptions, queer people are the product of those straight relationships. We
Hmm.
reproduce ourselves out of their bodies, and it's a different kind of relationship to power, to a different kind of power. And I find it endlessly fascinating. But it was impossible for me. I started writing the column when I was 26 years old, and I was callow and young and gay and dumb about some stuff, as almost all
Mm.
26-year-old gay white men are. The column has been as much of an education for me as it's been for some of my readers or many of my readers. I've learned so much writing this column about so many different kinds of people, different life experiences, and different queer experiences, also different straight experiences, because there's not just one universal straight experience. And yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Too much pot.
No. No, I appreciate that. And I also appreciate, I do want to take it back to how frequently you'll tell people that something is above your pay grade, and you'll reach out to an expert. And you said that you just told me that you're the expert in finding experts. Why is it important for your listeners to understand when seeking out an expert is needed? You do very frequently point people to that. I mean, I know that I know the answer for me, because in my own writing, in my own advocacy, on my own social media, I am very quick to tell people when I am not the expert in the room. My last
Mm.
nonfiction book, I'm like, okay, well, this is just my take on things. Here's 1,000 other opinions by people way more well qualified than I am on this subject. So why is it so important to you, though, when being professionally right is your job?
I think what I'm trying consciously to model in the column is that, especially when it comes to sex and relationships, gender expression, there is no one right answer. There are answers, plural, and
Mm,
the right answer is to seek answers, is to find people who might have the answer or an answer, and bring them in. Like that's the impulse you want to encourage when it comes to sex. There's this weird thing with, we talk about sex education. If you've ever raised a kid, your kid does not want to talk to you about sex. They'll tell you they know everything. And I think there's actually something really hardwired to the human condition and experience. Even if you factor out religion, there's something hardwired in us that is sex negative, for reasons
mm,
we can get into. And it's like very much dorm room stoned 2 a.m. conversation stuff. And so we feel somehow implicated or dirty if we're looking for the answer to a question that we should know the answer to already or shouldn't be interested in the answer to, because it's dirty and it's a sex thing, and sex should happen
Mm.
spontaneously and naturally without a lot of forethought, without a lot of, what is that called in the law when you plan the crime? Without a lot of
Premeditation.
yeah, premeditation, conspiracy, but premeditation. That sex without premeditation is good, and sex with premeditation, you thought about it too much, means you're a dirty pervert. And so, what I've always
There
consciously
seems
tried
to
to
be
model in the column is
there seems to be a
you're
lot
not
of
a
that
dirty pervert
my
if you want the
body.
answer.
Yeah, this is my body. I know what my body is. I know how my body should work. And if my body isn't working the right way, or if I don't understand something that's happening with my body or the way that it's making me feel, something must be wrong with me. And I can't talk
And
to
if I
anybody about that because clearly everybody else has this whole having a body thing down.
and maybe if I just ignore it, it'll
Mm,
go away. And as you know, gay people, queer people can attest, you can try to ignore it, it ain't going anywhere.
that's true. Something that people may not know about you, or at least because it's been a few years, is you actually co-founded the It Gets Better project. Did you have any idea at the time what that was
No.
gonna do? What could I ask the process that went into creating that? And then what's it been like watching it turn into what it's become?
Terry and I were read about a suicide of this kid in Indiana. And it was just that one kid's suicide in the summer of 2010. And I was really distraught about it. Because, as an adult gay person, you read about a younger gay person, 15 years old, taking his own life. And I'll cry if I talk about it. But your your feeling is, if I could have only talked to that kid for 5 minutes,
Mm,
right? But I'm not allowed to talk to that kid because that's grooming or recruiting, as they used to call it in the 70s when I was a kid. Gays can't have their own children, so they're trying to recruit yours. And now that's called grooming and groomers. And so the deal that the culture made with us in like the 80s and into the 90s was, you can be as gay as you want to be, you can come out, once you get out of high school, if you survive, then you can be gay. There's just one thing you can't do. You can't talk to the kids we're still torturing in that high school that you got out of, or in the same family, even sometimes, that you got out of. And if you try to talk to that kid, we're going to call you a pedophile. And so I was like turning that over in my head, thinking, I wish I could have talked to that kid. I'm not allowed to talk to that kid. And I just said, wait, there's YouTube. I can talk to that kid. And I
mm,
don't have to be in the same room with that kid, and nobody can stop me. It's not like create a gay youth support group or a GSA, and then the kid feels like they have to walk through that door, which can be a challenge for a lot of kids. Just like sometimes for adults who are just coming out, it's challenging to walk into that gay bar. It used to be. I hope this is less so the case now. I hope it's easier for people to come out now. That's what we've been fighting for decades, right? And I thought, okay, what I wanted to tell that kid was, it gets better. And here's how it gets better. Like, one of the criticisms of the project was it was passive. You just sit back and wait, and it'll get better all around you. But anybody who watched more than 4 of the videos, what you saw were queer people of all kinds sharing what they did to make it better, what they said to their families, how they extricated themselves in some instances from horrible situations, and sharing that knowledge. We don't raise the next generation of queer people. The black kid with black parents is going to get strategy from the black parents around navigating racism, and the kid with Jewish parents who's Jewish is going to get strategy and insight and support from their parents about encountering and navigating a world full of people who are anti-Semitic. The gay kid goes home to parents that they usually can't say anything to about what's being
mm,
done to them, and it's very isolating. And so we have all this hard-earned wisdom and no way to impart it. And that's where the It Gets Better project, the idea was like, I'm going to invite people. Terry and I made a video, and it wasn't the best It Gets Better video. It was the prototype, where we just talked about like where we were at 15 and what we didn't think our lives would look like and what our lives look like now. And it wasn't about like, oh, look at our car and look at our like things. It was, look at our relationships and how they're different now, and who our parents are now versus who our parents were then. And I asked other people, I rolled it out on my podcast and said, Can people just make these videos? Go like say what you would have said to that kid if you'd had that 5 minutes and upload it. And I thought maybe we'd get 100 videos. I wanted to have a little online resource that I could like share with my listeners or readers, refer people to this little archive. And within the first like 48 hours, there were 5,000 videos. There was all this untapped wisdom and hard earned, sometimes at great personal and painful cost, wisdom in queer people that would benefit young queer people that had no place to go, no way to reach these young queer people. And the It Gets Better project just blew that up. And in a way, I said at the time, was that whole edifice collapsed, that you can be who you want after you're 18. Once you get away, you just can't talk to that 15-year-old in that church where you were spiritually abused, because we will call you a pedophile. And that was such a politically damaging charge that we were just like, all right, do what you want, torture those kids. Hopefully we can be there for them when they get the hell away from you. And what happened with It Gets Better was like, this is social media. This is on their phones, on their computers. This is in your house. We don't have to get you to bring your kid to the gay youth support group. We brought the gay youth support group to your kid. And it was very like, some people thought it was all soft, focus, up with people, kind of soft edged. But in a way, it was very aggressive, because what the It Gets Better project said was, yeah, we're going to talk to your kid, and we're going to talk to your kid in your house. And I got emails and comments from 15-year-old queer kids who told me that they were under the covers in their parents' house watching these videos, and it was working. I mean, the most shattering one I got was this poor girl who'd come out to her parents as a lesbian, and they'd done the full like into reparative therapy, screaming and yelling, threatening to throw her out of the house if she didn't take it back. And she lied, she lied and said, told them what she had to tell them under duress, that she was confused but not a lesbian, and they were right, and she was totally a lesbian. And the thing she said that has stuck with me for like, it's been since 14 years, was every day I get up and I go downstairs, and I can't talk about all the crying. You have to cut out all this crying. I sound like a weepy bag of slop. I'm
Oh
supposed to
no,
be
I'm
this
gonna
asshole
turn
on the
the
internet.
volume up on it.
And she said, every morning I go downstairs and I look at my mom and I look at my dad and I love them for who they're going to be.
Mm.
And she had that image in her head of who her parents could be in 10 years, because she'd seen those parents, people with parents who had the same reaction her parents did, whose parents were sitting next to them at the table, apologizing, talking about how they came around. And she had this mental image now of what was possible in her
Mm.
family in time. When she got to a place where she wasn't so vulnerable and she could come out to them without being threatened or retaliated against or shoved into a reparative therapy program the way she had been. And she was telling us that because of the videos, she was able to do at that moment what her parents were incapable of doing, which was loving them. Her parents could not love her, and she was going to love them. And really, that is, in a way, kind of like what most coming out narratives are about. You come out and there's this feeling, this fear that your parents' love is conditional. And the only way to find out if that's true, or it will be true forever if they can't get past that, is to risk it, is to come out to them. And I think coming out is an act of love that isn't always met with love in return right away. But we love our parents through the coming out process
Mm.
and hopefully get to the other side. And for me, that was always the most powerful thing about the It Gets Better project, was all those kids with terrible parents who were doing and saying all the wrong things, seeing people who were 10 years older than they were, who had the same terrible parents they had, but no longer had terrible parents.
I know what those emails and those DMs and stuff sound like. I know how they read, because last year I I shared I mean, I've been pretty open about my story, but I kind of wrote this big long
It was so
thing.
beautiful.
Oh, well, thanks. I think that's how you found me. But
Yeah, that is how I
Yeah,
found you, and
my "Let Kids Be Kids" video where it's a little bit more pointed than some of the "It Gets Better" videos. A little bit more like, "Hey, I'm gonna kneecap you." But, you know, what's interesting is that some of the negative feedback that you got is, "Well, this is too passive and this is too whatever," and so what? So, yeah, yes, it is passive. Yes, if somebody has to opt in to watching the video, but the good thing about that is people can watch those kinds of videos when they're ready to watch them. They can watch them
Mhm.
in a setting where other people may not, where they may not have to be watched by other people while they're watching the video.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard from a ton of kids, a ton of youth, a ton of young adults that said that it helped them. Some people even that were in my, same area of East Texas, some folks that even went to the same school. But
Wow.
the bigger thing about some of this passive activism, this, uploading and then letting people opt in is the number of emails and messages that I got from people that said, "Oh, oh, I get it now. I thought this was a grooming. I thought talking to kids. I thought letting kids feel seen. I thought all of that. I thought that was a grooming thing. I thought that I'd been told that that was grooming. That's what I believed." Because when
Ugh.
you're weaponizing children, it's really easy to manipulate people's feelings about marginalized communities. But I think that having those kinds of resources up and that number of stories, that number of different types of stories, one of those stories is going to get through to somebody, is going to be the thing that somebody else hears and says, "Oh, that person looks like me. That person is from where I'm from. That person is in the same socioeconomic situation that I'm in, and that person survived, or that person had love in their heart, and that's okay. I get it now. They are able to talk to me in a way that other people aren't able to talk to me." So yeah, yeah, okay. So it's passive. Okay, not
The
every act of activism is, I don't know,
s sometimes the passivity
pitchforks.
criticism came from a place of weird reverse double backflip photo negative privilege. One of the criticisms of the project from queer people, and those were the ones that stung the most, was that it told kids to do nothing and wait. And somebody started kind of a rival It Gets Better project that would do it better called Make It Better. And it was about found a GSA, you have to do this, you have to do that. And
Oh
the
God,
reality, if you
I would have
know
been
queer kids who
killed.
are exactly, there are queer kids who the message they needed to receive was you're not
Survive.
betraying you're not betraying anybody if you can't come out yet. Like one of the criticisms It Gets Better was we weren't telling people to come out. And like, oh, we're not getting 15-year-olds murdered in East Texas.
No.
Yeah, we are not doing that. Sometimes what a 15-year-old needs to hear is like, here's the 3-year, 36-month plan to get into a college in another state or on the other side of the state that you're on, where you are, where you can have some more freedom and
Mhm.
find some people that you feel safe coming out to. We heard from kids like who are growing up on Mormon evangelical Mormon conservative whack job compounds, telling that kid that he was letting down the side because he wasn't out at school. And so he wasn't making it better for the freshmen at his school who were gay and closeted or queer and closeted was so irresponsible. And that was one of the criticisms that we weren't telling everybody that they should be out and out right now without any regard for their particular circumstance or their safety. Yeah, I'm old and gay. I get really frustrated when I came out in high school in the fucking 1980, right? Ronald Reagan was president. AIDS hadn't happened yet. It was a different time, and it was not easy to be out. I forgot what I was going to say. I had a relevant point. Anyway, I'll stop talking. I was going to say
So,
something, and now I don't remember what.
I bet you'll remember,
I'm,
you're a
I'm not.
professional.
I'm not high right now. I wouldn't get high and do a podcast. I'm not. I'm a professional, but I do smoke a lot of pot, and I think sometimes the train leaves the station without me on it.
Oh gosh. It must be something about Seattle or something. I just interviewed Jinx Monsoon, and it was the same kind of conversation.
I'm so sorry. I love Jinx. Jinx is the
I do
person I
too.
always cite as the reason no one should take my advice.
Oh God, why? Wait, why?
Because Jinx was a Seattle performer, was a student here, and was appearing in s- musicals here. And Jinx is a tremendous talent.
I know
And
she's going to be at Carnegie Hall. I'm so
I
excited.
know this is why, because she didn't listen to my advice. That's why she's going to be at Carnegie Hall. And so she did a couple of viral videos, Have a Little Twink. She did a kind of parody of Have a Little Priest. And she's so good, so
Uh-huh.
good, such an amazing
Yeah.
musical theater performer. And she came up to me, we were friends. She came up to me and said, like, oh, I'm thinking about going on Drag Race. And I was like, don't go on Drag Race. Move to New York, be in musical theater, be a star, be Elaine Stritch. If you go on Drag Race, you're going to end up on like the drag queen circuit, which is great, and I'm glad it exists. And I love RuPaul. In part, one of the things I love most about RuPaul is that it's the one place on TV you see queer people who, from all different sorts of socioeconomic backgrounds, you meet queer people. Latrice Royale, who've been to prison. How often do you get to see that on television? You see people who, English isn't their first language.
Hmm.
RuPaul's Drag Race has been, in some ways, a little bit like Savage Love My Column, where there's this sneaky political thing going on underneath it, this subversive, like talking to straight people, getting them to read sometimes about the AIDS crisis or whatever. RuPaul has subtly blown up the way most queer people are represented on television as kind of white and middle class and have, from one particular experience or background. And I love that about it. But I was said to Jinx, like, oh my God, you're Elaine Stritch. Go to New York, be a star, be a musical theater star, a contratenor. Like, go. Don't do Rue. I don't want to. Your talent is too enormous to be contained just by the drag circuit, which is great, and a lot of talented queens out there. I'm not like sneering at drag. I did drag for a decade. I was a drag queen, and Jinx ignored me
Did
and
I know
went
that?
on
What?
RuPaul and is now in Chicago on Broadway and performing at Carnegie Hall because she didn't take my advice. Let that be a lesson to everyone.
You were a drag queen?
I was for a decade.
What was your name?
Helvetica Bold. I
That's
will send you a picture of me in drag. It's pretty nice.
I'm gonna post that to social media. I might use it as the cover art for this episode.
The story on how I ended up doing drag is actually kind of funny too, because I started writing Savage Love when I was living in Madison, Wisconsin, and the other people who started the paper had moved here from Madison, sold the Onion, moved here, started the Stranger, and I then moved here. And it didn't occur to me to write the column under a pseudonym. Dan Savage is my real name.
Yeah.
And so when I moved here, the column was this enormous hit already. And they were selling T-shirts at Pike Place Market that said "I am Dan Savage" because everybody was like curious who this person was. So people were like claiming to be me, and I started getting asked to come and like host events and host gay bingo to raise money for HIV/AIDS or host gay political fundraisers. And I was like, well, I really like that I get to be me and not be recognized. And so I didn't want people to be able to put my face together with my column because I'm sometimes rude to people. And so I started doing drag. I would go in drag. I had a drag mom, Zora, who would paint my face, taught me how to do drag, would do my wigs, and I have an aesthetic sense, so I
How
knew what
high
kind of
were your
dresses I wanted.
heels?
Very high. I was like a Amazon Barbie, and the straight guys loved me because I looked like a penthouse model from the 80s, and I would like ping onto their adolescent sort of the kinds of women that were presented to them in the 80s and 90s kind of sex dar, and I would ping because I looked like a penthouse pet from the 80s. And yeah, that was fun having that effect
You know,
on straight boys.
I want to go back because you brought up RuPaul, and you both share a pretty unique position in culture as having been very visible during a lot of different very big conversations. And you've also been very visible for a very, very, very long time, which with that visibility comes the fact that you've had to evolve
Mm.
in public. Over the years, we've seen your stances on subjects grow as the culture has grown. You've withstood your fair share of criticism for views, political views, sure, but you also a lot of social causes, both within and without of the queer community. You've been called to the task about fat shaming, misogyny, biphobia, transphobia.
Acephobia.
I
Don't leave acephobia out. It would be acephobic of you
yes.
to leave acephobia out.
So I mean, you started all of this in your 20s. I was an idiot in my 20s. I also started my little podcast in 2009 when I was still in college. And
What were you
I am
thinking?
so glad that my visibility, such as it is, happened now
Hmm.
and not in 2009 because I had a lot of very dumb opinions in my 20s that I'm very glad just weren't as visible as yours were. So how'd you check in with yourself? How did you grow publicly? How did you pivot? How did you learn? How did you like you brought up the ghost of Ann Landers previously and said sometimes the question askers were right and she was wrong. How did you learn to say that? How'd you do that publicly?
Anybody who's been writing a column for 30 plus years and hasn't evolved hasn't really been writing a column. Writing is thinking. And if you've been writing something weekly for 30 years and you didn't move or change or evolve on anything, you weren't really writing because you weren't really thinking. I think one of the things that's really interesting about having started to write a column before the internet existed and then it coming into the internet is to read old Mike Royko. He was a columnist in Chicago Sun-Times for many, many years. When I was a kid, to read an old Mike Royko column, you had to go to the Chicago Public Library and look it up on microfilm, right? And everything about that process was telling you this is ancient. And it would put in your head, maybe Mike Royko doesn't think this anymore
Mm,
because look how old this is. The internet came along and suddenly something you wrote 20 years ago is on a website with ads for movies that are opening today, presented on that website looking exactly like the column you wrote yesterday is this
mhm,
25-year-old column. And outrage culture and some like Twitter clout chasers, they exist out there, and sometimes their criticisms are valid even if they're poorly motivated. Running around waving a column you wrote 25 years ago like a bloody shirt, encouraging people to perceive it as something you wrote today or still
mm,
think today. So how did I move? Well, you get a lot of criticism. And I think the Catholic in me and the way I was raised was you had to accept that there may be, as painful as like getting criticized is, they may have a point and you have to show up for it and take it in. And of course you're going to be defensive, but that's like part of writing and like thinking things through and batting it around and growing. When asexuality first kind of like burst onto the scene as not just low sexual desire or anorgasmia, but as a sexual orientation, which was when the asexuality and visibility network, I can't remember what it's called exactly, that website founded by David J really just kicked asexuality into the public consciousness. And my reaction was, what the fuck is this? Right? My reaction was, I knew so many people who claimed to have no sexual desire because they were so disturbed by what they sexually desired that I was
mm,
dubious about asexuality. I was a gay person in the 80s. I knew lots of people who said that they just weren't into anything. And what they meant was, I'm gay and I'm not coming out. Right. And so that was the bias I brought to the arrival of asexuality as a topic. And I was incredibly skeptical. But I was also, it was the aughts, it was the 90s. Like everybody was a shit poster and took taking the
sure.
piss in a way that just
The
did
tone
not
that we
play the
all had in the
same,
early 2000s was much more
doesn't
acerbic.
play now. And people aren't quite cognizant of the context or the culture at that moment. And I got a lot of pushback and people arguing with me. And my response was always, oh, okay, here's this David J guy. Come on my show. Or not, I don't think I had a podcast then, but like be in my column. Here's a question
Mhm.
about asexuality. Here's my feeling about this. And I think some of the things I said that asexual people didn't like and still don't like are perfectly valid. If
Mhm.
you come out as asexual after you've entered into a relationship with someone where you believed yourself to be sexual, that has implications. And it's not
Sure.
acephobic of your partner to want to perhaps end that relationship. And I said to asexuals some of what I said to people who are bisexual that bisexuals didn't like. Bisexuals famously in the 90s and aughts would complain that monosexuals, homosexuals and heterosexuals, wouldn't want to date them because gay people had a problem with bisexuals and straight people had a problem with bisexuals, and it was just awful out there for the bisexuals. And one of the things I said was like, "Have it occurred to you to date each other?" Like I date bi guys. I'm fine with bi guys. I had a bi boyfriend. It wasn't a problem. But like every time bisexual people got together to complain about dating, it was there was one bisexual person on the planet, and their options were straight people or gay people, and it sucked. And I was like, well, why? Wait 1 minute. Not that there weren't bi people out there dating other bi people. There, of course there were, but in the discourse, it wasn't talked about. And same thing, I got a little trouble for asexuals when I said, like, okay, yeah, there's a tremendous pressure if you're out there dating allosexuals to be sexual in a way that you don't want to be. There now exists the internet and the Asexuality Visibility and Education Network. It's possible to find each other now. You have options, including an open relationship, a kind of romantic partnership that allows your allosexual partner to seek sex elsewhere. There's ways to structure this that honors your asexuality and you don't have to do anything sexual that you don't want to. And I didn't think that was acephobic. Some people did, but some of what I did say was straight up like, I don't believe this.
Mm.
Now I believe it. And now the research is in. Dr. Lori Brodo has been on my show a million times from the University of British Columbia, talking, and she's done just incredible, groundbreaking research into asexuality as a sexual orientation. And all of that data kind of like came up behind it. I had the same deeply skeptical reaction to PrEP when PrEP came along because I read the first studies and they seemed to be shot through with some wishful thinking because it relied on a kind of compliance that wouldn't be there outside a clinical setting. And I was skeptical of PrEP. People still sometimes bring up, like, oh, you were the guy against PrEP. And like, no, I was the guy who was skeptical when I read the first studies. And then as more studies came in, I was like,
Which, I mean,
endorsed.
somebody that lived
Absolutely.
through and was at the forefront of the AIDS crisis in the late 80s, early 90s has every right to be a little skeptical because we've all seen. I mean, anybody that studied the history of
Yes.
the AIDS crisis has seen that there was a lot of wonder drugs that
Wishful
were
thinking.
supposed to be,
There was
the
also wishful
magic bullet
thinking
to keep
early
us all
that
alive and healthy and protected and safe.
I was there when everyone was like, to say this is sexually transmitted is homophobic,
Mm.
that this is a plot to ruin gay sex and to stop us from having sex with each other. And there was anecdotal evidence that it seemed to be sexually transmitted, and nobody wanted to accept that. And there was a lot of shooting of the messengers that people forget now about those early years of the HIV AIDS crisis because we want to look at it through the prism of our own, the heroism of our community and the way that our community came together to save ourselves and each other. But there was a lot of not that at the beginning when it was the white hot panic stage. And gay people were having to be told things they didn't want to hear, like, you should stop having sex with so many people for a little while, maybe, which gay people had to hear at the beginning of the monkeypox outbreaks. And some gay people said and did the exact same things that gay people who at the beginning of the AIDS crisis were like, it's homophobic to say it's sexually transmitted. It's homophobic to say have more sex with fewer partners, which was an early and very controversial HIV prevention message that we had to sort of revive for monkeypox, and people got upset. One of the, while we're on this subject of like the things I got wrong and the people I pissed off, this is what I got right. I wrote something dumb and juvenile and jokey about gender confirmation surgery. I used an
Mm.
expression that I'm going to use, and brace yourselves, because some people find this very upsetting, getting your dick cut off, right? To
Oh.
talk about male to female gender reassignment surgery. Kate Bornstein, who I'm sure you're familiar with, a writer, Hello, Cruel World is her book, one of her books. And she was a Seattle person at that time. She lives in New York now. And she came up to me in a restaurant and was like, "That's not how it works. And that's obnoxious." And I was like, "Hi, Kate Bornstein. I know who you are." The next time I had a question about a trans thing, I took it to Kate Bornstein and said, "Give me your what's the answer? Give me the answer." And she wrote a response that then I included in my column in conversation with Kate Bornstein so that I would get it right. But it was because Kate Bornstein came up to me and she didn't really yell at me. She has a sense of humor. She's old school. She was like, "Hey, F you, savage." And like, this is how it actually works. This is how mine worked. And then the next time the question came up, she was in my column and she'd been in my column a dozen times speaking to the trans experience. And that I think is where I get it right. Like when I get it wrong, when I step on it, like with asexuality, my response wasn't to go to the mattresses and build a wall around myself. It was to get David J., who was kind of the leader of the asexual identity movement at that time, up onto my platform. Like what my readers heard from me was incorrect. Let's let my readers hear from David J. Let's let my readers
Mhm.
hear from Kate Bornstein instead. And I got the education I needed from Kate at the same time as I was imparting that education to my readers, who obviously needed it because what they'd read in my column previously was wrong.
You you have gotten a few things right over the years as well. You have been rather instrumental in normalizing a lot of topics that are considered pretty taboo. The first of which I want to talk about is a favorite in our household, especially with your mentioning earlier of talking to queer kids, talking to young kids, and how taboo that act, the idea that we would ever be in conversation with young people as though queer people just pop into existence at the age of 18 somehow. You executive
We leap
produced a
fully
show.
formed out of the back of gay bars.
You executive produced a show that we love in our household called The Real O'Neills,
Oh my
which
God.
was rather revolutionary, especially now. I don't know that the show would get made now, which is odd to think about, or at least not in the way that it was made, because it did talk about things like sex, like the fact that teenagers think about that, the fact that, just some of these normal conversations for teens to have, that it centered a queer person and an imperfect family on their journey to get it right. What role do you think that show played in helping to normalize those very specific kinds of conversations? And what role do you think media plays in general in normalizing marginalized communities to the, overculture?
I don't know what role that show played. It was only on for a season and a half. I loved the performers, Martha
Well,
Plimpton, Noah
we've seen it
Galvin.
at least 8
Everyone
times,
was
so it feels
so
like it was
good.
on much longer.
Yeah. I executive produced that show. I pitched an idea to ABC and they bought it. And then they hired writers who did a very different show. And it's hard when you go through that kind of experience to assess the quality of the show because it's not the show you wanted to make. That was made around you instead. And so I was a little bit like the Queen of England on that show. I was consulted, but I wasn't like, no one had to do anything I said, and no one did. So yeah, that's a hard thing to talk about. You kind of blindsided me when you said The Real O'Neills. I was like, oh no. Because Hollywood is a compliment based economy. You're never like that Tina Fey clip that went out with her saying to Bowen Yang, "You can't say what you really think of Saltburn. You are too famous." Like
Mhm.
anybody who's ever worked on anything in Hollywood, you're not allowed. You're only allowed to say that you loved it, which might be true sometimes, but isn't true
It's
every
not true all the
time.
time.
And
Yeah, when my
yeah,
when my last book came out, which was my debut in traditional publishing, I was debuting with Simon and Schuster. All of my author friends who had already gone through it all were like, "Okay, you're about to cross a velvet rope. You no longer get to have opinions about other people's books on
nope.
social. You don't get to talk about other people's books, especially the books that you dislike. You just don't get to
Only
have
blurbs. Only
any
blurbs.
opinions about other people's books. If you have a Goodreads, shut it down. Also, don't go there." Like,
I
yeah,
am
and
I'm
as my
from
social media has
newspapers.
turned into what it's become, I've learned I don't there's a lot of things I don't get to have an opinion about.
Yeah. My trick is I don't like to say things I don't mean. So I say nothing if I don't have anything nice to say. Listening to our mothers decades later, there's something to that advice they gave us way back when. Yeah. So yeah, the real
Also,
O'Neills, that is
Hump.
a thing that happened.
It is a thing that happened. It's a thing that happens at least once a year in my house. My husband rewatches it a lot.
I've rewatched it for Noah uh, and Martha and some of the other actors who I just worship. So
Sure.
yeah, it is what
You
it is.
also
Like,
make Hump, which is
yes,
a
let's
very
talk about
different
that.
kind of show than the real O'Neills. Was
Humpfilmfest.com.
Yeah, what's that?
20 years ago at The Stranger, we started joking about having an amateur porn contest, an amateur porn film festival where people would submit their amateur porn and we would show it in a movie theater. And this was like a risky and dangerous thing to do because we would be screening your homemade porn in a theater in Seattle in front of potentially your coworkers and neighbors and
Yeah,
family and friends.
yeah.
And we didn't know when we announced that we were doing a call for submissions for an amateur porn film festival whether anyone would submit anything. And we got tons of submissions and put on a festival, sold out every show. And we're now in the 19th year. This year we expanded it to, instead of having one festival a year, we're having two, Hump 1 in the spring and Hump 2 in the fall. It became something around us that we didn't necessarily realize it was becoming. It is it's people have come to Hump and pulled me aside in the lobby to say, I'm here under duress, my friends made me come, and I don't like porn, but they talked me into it. Here I am. And the same person has come up to me in the lobby afterwards to say, I loved this. And what distinguishes Hump from a lot of horrible gonzo porn on the porn tubes or commercial porn is that these are people making their own pornography, starring themselves and their lovers and their friends. And it's very deeply personal and subjective and varied. And almost all of it is funny. They're kind of comedic shorts, but with graphic sexual scenes or intercourse. Some of them are very serious. We had short documentaries in Hubs. Some things are very heartfelt. Some things are very moving. We had a film, it was either last year or the year before, made by a trans man right before he got top surgery. And it's this incredibly beautiful film where
Wow.
he is saying goodbye and thank you to his breasts. Because even though the dysphoria and wanting to live in a body that looked more, male default, he derived great pleasure from his breasts over the years, and he'd had sex partners who derived great pleasure. And he made a porno thanking and saying goodbye to his breasts that was porn, that was hardcore porn, that made people cry. I watched it and cried. And it was something that I'd never seen expressed anywhere ever before, a kind of feeling that a trans person might have about their body pre-transition and post-transition. And seeing dysphoria represented not as this kind of, like, as it's often portrayed, as this loathing or inability to live with or in, and so these changes must be made, but this ability to have lived in both and to have a preference but not anger. And it was that those kinds of films are what make Hump Hump, and also the crazy films that make people scream and jump under their chairs.
Yeah, I've never seen it, Mom. Never would either. Never would. I'm a virgin. But I
Porn, I've only read about it.
yep, no, only it's for the articles. So I remember listening to an episode of your show where you did talk about some of the videos from that year, and I remember hearing about centaur porn on your show, and I was like, "Oh, what?
I
Oh,
talk about
what?"
centaur porn a lot. I talk about centaur porn so much, it's my go-to example for a particular thing so frequently that people think I'm a secret closet centaur fetishist, which I'm not. But if I was, that would be fine. And if I was, I probably wouldn't be closeted about it. But yeah,
I just because my brain doesn't even go there, and I'm just like, okay, I love how big
all
our world is.
all those kids who saw the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movies with centaurs, Or is it Lord of the Rings that has centaurs? There's some movies that have centaurs that were huge. Some of those kids
See,
came
my
away
brain
from those
immediately thinks of
movies.
like Xena and all those like weird, like poorly CGI'd centaurs.
Yeah, maybe that. Maybe that. Those are the people talk about sex robots. Like the sex robots are going to come and it's going to be really
Oh god.
unnerving because you're going to find out your neighbor's wife is actually a robot. You couldn't tell. And I'm like, no,
Uh-huh.
no, no, no. What's going to be disturbing about the coming of the sex robots are the centaurs and the 50-foot tall women. What the sex robots are going to make possible is the realization of fetishes and
Uh-huh.
desires and fantasy archetypes that were only imaginary. They could only exist in our imaginations, are going to be made real. 50-foot tall woman is literally a fetish. Some billionaire is going to have one built.
Kind of shocked that we haven't gotten satellite footage of one already
Elon building
existing.
that. Yeah. Maybe
Yeah.
that's why he wants to get to Mars so he can do it on the one side of Mars and nobody can spy on him with his own satellites.
Anything ever hit too close to home? You ever read a question or get a message from a reader or something? Does it ever hit too close to home when you're giving other people advice? Does it ever like, ooh, ouch,
All the
this is a little
time.
too close?
All the time. Sometimes people say advice columns have a pro woman bias. Most advice columns are written by women. Most people who ask for advice, that cliche, men won't ask for directions and women will stop the car and ask for directions. Advice is the same thing. Like it's mostly women are writing into advice columns. But you have a bias to the person who wrote you the letter. It's just that a lot of them are women. And so it ends up looking like you have a bias for women. The bias we really have, anybody who writes an advice column, is for the solvable problem. The person who wrote in with a circumstance or situation where you're like, oh, there's something I can say here that might help. You get letters every day where you're like, I can't help you. And sometimes people are in such dire circumstances or have so thoroughly screwed the pooch, there's no one screwing that pooch. And you can write people back every once in a while and say, I'm so sorry, but I don't know how to help you. And that is a terrible feeling, right? The letters that you get where you're like, oh, there's something I can say here that might make a difference. You hear back from people who say it did make a difference, and that's so rewarding. But it is balanced out in the end by the letters. So many letters from people that either can't be helped or that you can't help. And whichever one it is, it's sometimes crushing.
How many yachts or second homes or sports cars has your therapist been able to buy off of your therapy bills? Because I know those have to be high. Giving
I
giving
have
giving this much of yourself and going to as many places as you have to go to with some. I mean, yeah, a lot of your questions are kind of funny or kind of, but you gotta. I mean, you're very public. You're very out there. You get this. You constantly. How do you fill up your own well?
I'm very much an introvert.
What?
I stay home. I don't. I read. I hang out with my husband and his boyfriend, and I hang out with my boyfriend. But other than that, I don't do much. Go many. I just joined the gym. We had a home gym post
Just
COVID, and I just started going to the real gym again after using the home gym and having to interact with people at the real gym again, which is challenging me. But I recharge just by yeah. I'm just one of those people who's like fine alone. I've never actually been to therapy. I've gone to a couples counselor. Terry and I went to couples therapy for a while when we were like yelling divorce in each other's face for about a
mm.
year. And we got through it. I'm really glad we got through it. It's one of the things marriage does for you. Like undoing this is going to be really hard. Maybe couples counseling will be less hard, right? Like we came
you
this
know,
close.
not to. I know that we're wrapping up, but
Oh, are we?
you're
I'm here for 3 more hours. I'm not going anywhere. You cannot hang up on me. I will not have it. I thought this was like Rogan. I thought we just talked until we dropped.
babe, I would the listen. I would give a few of my choicest organs for a percentage of what Rogan is getting. This is
Oh, and you compared me to RuPaul, and I'm like, I wish I had her ranch.
Oh, I live on a horse ranch.
I know. I know. I don't have any. I don't have any oil wells or fracking toasters or whatever the hell people get mad at Rue
Fracking
for having on a
toasters.
ranch.
No, your show was the first time that I ever got the aha moment. I'm sure it wasn't the first time I ever heard it, but you're talking about kind of passive activism. Your show was the first time I ever heard somebody say that just because a relationship wasn't forever doesn't mean it wasn't successful. And I think that might
I think
be
I was the
because
first person to say
a
that.
lot of people credit me these days, just of how I talk about. I try very much to stay in my lane.
Mhm.
That's how I avoid getting yelled at these
Don't
days.
make me have you whacked.
That's nope. not, not taking that bait. But a lot of people like to point to the way that I talk about like literary criticism, and I don't say that something is like a good book or a bad book or a good poem or a bad poem. I talk about whether or not it was a successful poem or an unsuccessful poem. And the more that I've thought about your advice over the years, the more I think I might actually have stolen that from you. But just
Well,
that it wasn't a good marriage or a bad, like, it just because it ended in divorce or just because the relationship ended doesn't mean that it wasn't good, and it doesn't mean that it wasn't successful. And I have given that advice to so many people and pointed them back to you.
thank you.
Oh, you're
It's
welcome.
it's crazy that a relationship is the only thing that if everybody gets out alive, it was a failure.
Yeah.
And I've been pushing back against that forever. One of the things that made it hard when Terry and I were talking about divorce was thinking, well, this is going to be very embarrassing because I'm the relationship guy and the advice guy. And even though I had said my whole professional career, a marriage can end, a relationship can end. And if people are on good terms, they look back, they learned, they grew, they could be in the same room with their ex, they wish their ex well, even if they can't be in the same room with their ex, or if, they manage to circle back after a year or two and have a friendship and reconnect. How is that not a success?
Mm,
Two people stay married for 6 years and they hate each other the entire time. They've done nothing but emotionally abuse and undermine and crap all over each other and destroy their kids and extended families with their drama and baloney, but they died married. So that was a successful marriage. Like,
mm.
it's so arbitrary and just not true. But I give it to you and you can have it. I have people all the time who credit me with there's your logical family and your biological family, because I
Oh, I've
use
not
that
heard
on my
that.
show all the time. Talk about, your biological family may not be your logical family. And I hopefully there's a lot of overlap between your biological family and your logical family, but as queer people, I
Sure.
think it's all people. You go out there and you find your people, you find your logical family. That's Armistead Maupin. He wrote that in Tales of the City. The very first Tales of the City book has gay characters in the 70s talking about their logical family. And so that's constantly credited to me. I always speak up when I see it credited to me to credit Armistead, who I'm just in awe of his talent and also his longevity, all the books he's written. But if you want to take, because you're much younger than I am, I'll be dead soon, and you'll still be
Oh
running your
yeah,
mouth 20 years from now.
so young. Thank you, Dan Savage. Very
If
young.
you want to take if a relationship can end and not be a failure and make it yours, just remember me every once in a while. Remind people about me every once in a while. Because people forget the minute you stop running your mouth doing your advice column, nobody remembers who Ann Landers was. I talk to people in their 30s and they're like, I'm a huge fan of Ann Landers. And they're like, who's that?
Really?
Yes.
I feel like gay people, I feel like queer people, I feel like we have a different relationship to certain types of media. Yeah, like I know who Ann
I haven't.
Landers is. I know who a lot of those advice column, like I know those names. I also know that they weren't that wasn't their real name, and that name has been shared by a lot of people. And but I just feel like we hold space for different pieces of culture, and we remember things that other people don't in a very special kind of way.
We do. We do. And I don't know, why is that? What is it about? What is it that being gay and not caring about the Super Bowl until Taylor Swift started jumping
Oh
on football
God.
player dick or
I'm
whatever
sorry.
she's doing
This
now?
connection is gonna it's gonna cut out. I can't say the Taylor. I can't say her name. I'm very terrified of
Why?
Swifties. I am
Oh,
terrified of
oh.
Swifties. They
I'm very
scare me.
I've been talking about her a lot on my show. Like, I'm very
Good for
pro
you.
Taylor Swift, but I couldn't name a single song.
Oh,
But I
come
also
on.
couldn't name a Beyonce song. No, I can't. Like, all the single ladies. Of course I heard of that one, but I'm
What do
I'm
you
very
listen to,
boring.
Dan Savage?
I listen to musicals from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s,
God, you're
60s,
so
and
gay.
less so some in the 70s. Some in the, I listen to Vicky Carr and Kay Starr. I'm a huge Edie Gourmet fan. Not so much Edie and Steve Lawrence, but Edie herself has like three amazing albums. She had such a beautiful, beautiful voice, and she became sort of a pop culture joke in the 70s and 80s in a way that made it hard for people to appreciate just the beauty of her singing voice. So, yeah, that's who I am. That like the crazy sex guy who writes about the most
I am
bananas
gonna,
sex acts.
I'm gonna call Jinx. I'm gonna tell her I'm gonna come stay on her couch, and then I'm gonna fly there, and I'm gonna force you to listen to Kelly Clarkson, Britney, Christina, Miley. Like none of the. Nope. Okay. Yeah, we're gonna have to
None
fix
of
that.
that.
Do you
But
miss?
why?
There's good music out there, Dan Savage.
But there's no room in the inn. Like, you're a young person. What are you, like 24, 22?
Yes, I am 24 years old, which is how I said that I started all of this when I was in college in 2009, and you're bad at math. So, yes, I am 24 years old. Yep, that's me.
Yes.
I'm
You're going
gonna
to reach
cut
a
that out
stage
and
of
send it to all
life
of my friends.
in like 20 years where there's just no, that you have old dead famous people in your head, like Jimmy Stewart and James Cagney,
Yeah.
who's not moving out. So there's no room for Ariana Grande, whoever that is. I could
Oh
walk
my,
by her on the street. I wouldn't know who she was. There's no room for her. Yeah, there's like, yeah, I
I was
have the
fine
music I
all the way up until this point. All the way. Do you miss the anonymity of those early years? Because these days, this is actually a big topic right now amongst authors of various
mm,
genres. How the author as a job, you pretty people didn't used to
fan
see us.
servicing.
We used to be a black and white photo. Maybe we used to be a black and white photo at the back of our various books. You didn't know who we were. You didn't. Authors didn't have to suddenly become influencers to try to sell our books because publishers used to market our books for us. You know this. You're an author.
Yeah.
So, and now the marketing budget is a spreadsheet that you get from your publisher, and it's, hey, what's all the marketing you plan on doing? We're going to take credit for that. Let me just put it on the spreadsheet. So, do you miss the anonymity, or do you like? Well, I don't know about like. Do you what do you like? Do you being in the
I,
spotlight?
I wish people would. I just think people need to accept that we're doing what they have asked us to do. Used to be, worked at a newspaper, you would bat ideas around in a newsroom or with your colleagues, and you would think out loud with your colleagues, and you would get challenged. Somebody would knock a bad idea down, you would think better of it, you wouldn't put it in print. With the arrival of social media, what everybody wants is to be in that meeting. They want to be there with you, batting ideas around, bouncing things off the wall. You can be there in that meeting, but part of the deal of being in that meeting is somebody can have a bad idea. And if they think better of it, you don't blast them for it. You're like, you were spitballing and that was a bad idea. And you're like, yeah, that was a bad idea. And the point you made is correct. And I'm reassessing like what I might write about that. That was the editorial process. And with the arrival of social media and these parasocial relationships people now have with writers and podcasters and authors and advice columnists, they want to be at the spitball meeting, but a lot of them are laying in wait at that meeting with knives out. Where if you have a bad idea or a bad impulse, you want to bounce something off the wall and it, lands like shit on the floor, there's this mobbing that can happen. It's like, no, you can't have both. You can't be at the editorial meeting and a vindictive, malignant presence at that meeting. You have to pick one. You can be privy to the writer's internal monologue and internal thought processes and how the work develops over time. and constructive with criticisms. Like if people are bouncing ideas around, they do want criticisms and feedback, but you can't be lunatics about it. You can't be prosecutorial about it. You have to be constructive and engaged. And I'm sure you're aware of this. I've experienced it. There are a lot of people where the engagement comes from a really genuine place. It can often be like my readers have been the best resource for my column and my podcast over the years. Things people have shared with me, things people have pushed back against that I got wrong, that they were right. And then I got right about it because of these positions. But I've had people like, what seems to be acting in very bad faith without
Mm.
an acceptance of you're being given what you wanted. You are at the editorial meeting. Here's how we conduct ourselves at the editorial meeting. There's there can be bad ideas. There are no bad actors. There is not a presumption of malice. You can't have a presumptions of malice and a constructive editorial meeting. And what it feels like to me, having come from newspapers, is that everybody's at the editorial meeting, but nobody understands what that requires of them.
Yeah,
And it's a problem for writers.
well, writer. I mean, a lot of people whose jobs used to be a lot more. I mean, even actors. I know, I'm people in the film industry and stuff. It's just we're all just a lot more visible and a lot more reachable than we used to be. I mean, I am less than Z list. I'm no absolutely nobody, but like people do know who I am, and it's
I know who you are.
it really is something
You
to
have something I had, though, the superpower of not living in New York or Los Angeles.
Chicago.
It's good to not be in New York or Los Angeles. It gets
Yeah,
less in your head.
I would probably that body dysmorphia that I had for so long probably would still just be just deeply buried. If I were in either of those places and constantly being surrounded by the world's most beautiful homosexuals, I would be just a mess
I
constantly.
think we need all the most beautiful homosexuals to all move to Los Angeles to torture each other,
I think we
and the
need them
rest
to
of us
move
to
into
get
the
on with it everywhere
sea,
else.
is what I.
Uh, I, I'm kind of a fan of beautiful homosexual. I like to, I've married a beautiful homosexual, I think,
You
and
did. You
I
did.
kind of
And I
did.
did. And it's wonderful and lovely. And that's great for him. And I'm sure Atlantis is beautiful this time of year. Dan Savage, I don't want to co opt any more of your time. Could you let folks know if they would like to get more of you? Where and how can they do that?
I am on Threads at Dan Savage, on Blue Sky at Dan Savage. I am still on Twitter at Fake Dan Savage. But for my column and my podcast and books and other stuff I do, savage.love. For years I wrote the column and it was 1,200 words long. The column is now behind a paywall, but the behind the paywall column is 1,800 words long. So there's as much Savage Love for free as there ever was, which is exactly what I did when I put the podcast behind a paid option for the podcast. We didn't shorten the podcast. We doubled the length of the podcast. So people who wanted more could pay. So you can subscribe at savage.love and get lots of me, or you can just go listen to half the podcast and read half the column for free.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been a privilege and an enlightening experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I so enjoy your stuff. And when I followed you and you pinged me back, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know quite how to react because
I
I'm
mean,
so
Dan
impressed.
Savage follows you. You have to say hello. Like, I did
Well,
immediately
I
get
was
into my group
starstruck.
chat and say, "What the hell do I do? What do I?
How
What?
do I get him to go away?
No, just like what do you do when you've been savaged suddenly, and you're like, why do people that I've been listening to for years suddenly perceive me? That's disquieting.
Well, you're incredibly intelligent and very eloquent and very compassionate, but you have that acerbic edge that makes you interesting and unpredictable and such a good listen. And I follow your podcast. I loved your. I'm terrible with names because of the drag queen who does math. I can't do math. I did
Pine
drag, but I can't do
that
math.
just came out last week. Look at
I,
you
I
listening to
listened
my
to it.
show.
I listened to it the other day, and it was a great and very moving interview. I love your stuff,
I
and I listened to your Jerry Saltz. I love Jerry Saltz and I have had a parasocial relationship forever on Twitter. and Instagram, and I love him, and I loved your interview with him. See, I would never have the balls to reach out to a Pulitzer Prize winning art critic about coming onto my silly show. So I admire your chutzpah.
Listen, I'm nobody, so I have nothing to lose. So I just like the only thing people are going to say is no or just ignore me. So, like, why not?
Well, I said yes, and I was really happy to, and happy to be asked. And don't think I'm not like waiting for a question to come in at Savage Lovecast that would be perfect for you to answer. Maybe the next time we get a centaur question because you live on a horse farm, so you have like half
Well, I'll
of the
have my
centaur
husband
thing
answer.
down.
He's the
Maybe
veterinarian.
there we go.